This story is based on the true survival account of Juliane Koepcke. The Fall from Heaven. Part 1. The Scientist's Daughter. The humid Lima air pressed against 17-year-old Juliane Koepcke's skin as she stood at Jorge Chávez International Airport on December 24, 1971, Christmas Eve. The familiar scent of aviation fuel mingled with the sweet aroma of tropical flowers that vendors sold outside the terminal, creating an olfactory cocktail that would forever mark this day in her memory. Beside her, her mother Maria adjusted her own travel documents with the practiced efficiency of someone who had made this journey countless times before. Maria Koepcke was no ordinary woman. Born Maria Emilie Anna von Mikulicz-Radke in Leipzig, Saxony, Germany, on 15 May 1924, she carried within her the intellectual legacy of Polish nobility and German academic excellence. Her parents were working at Lima's Museum of Natural History when she was born, establishing a life dedicated to understanding the natural world. Her father, Hans Wilhelm Koepcke, was equally distinguished in his field, a zoologist whose reputation for meticulous research had earned him recognition throughout South America. The Koepcke family represented the finest tradition of German scientific exploration. In the late 1940s, two German scientists were earning their doctoral degrees at the University of Kiel, in the German city of the same name. Hans Wilhelm Koepcke was a biologist, and Maria Emilie Anna von Mikulicz-Radke was an ornithologist. Their love story was one written in the language of taxonomy and field research, a romance that bloomed among specimen jars and research papers. Together they moved, and they married there in 1950, choosing Peru as their laboratory for understanding the intricate web of Amazonian life. Juliane had grown up in this world of scientific wonder. Born in Lima, Peru, on 10 October 1954, the only child of German zoologists Maria and Hans Wilhelm Koepcke, she had been raised among the specimens, field notes, and endless discussions of biodiversity that filled her parents' professional lives. Her childhood was spent not with toys and fairy tales, but with the real magic of discovering new species and mapping the complex relationships between predator and prey in the world's most biodiverse ecosystem. When Juliane was 14, her parents established Panguana, a research station located in the Amazon rainforest. There was no electricity, no running water, and very little outside influence. The station represented everything her parents believed in immersion in nature, dedication to scientific inquiry, and the courage to live on the very edge of the known world. It was here, in this remote outpost, that Hans Wilhelm waited for his wife and daughter to join him for the Christmas holidays. The decision to fly on December 24th had been made with some reluctance. Maria had initially hoped to find an earlier flight, but the holiday season had complicated their travel plans. Lanza Flight 508, a Lockheed L-188A Electra, was the best option available, despite the airline's questionable safety record. The aircraft, registration OBR 941, had been in service for over a decade, its aluminum skin bearing the scars of countless flights over Peru's challenging terrain. As they approached the departure gate, Juliane felt the familiar mixture of excitement and apprehension that accompanied visits to Panguana. The research station represented a world entirely different from her school life in Lima, a place where the sounds of civilization were replaced by the symphony of the jungle, where the concerns of teenage social life seemed utterly insignificant compared to the profound mysteries of evolution and adaptation that surrounded her parents' work. The boarding process was efficient, reflecting the practiced routine of an airline that specialized in flights to Peru's remote regions. Juliane Koepcke was seated in 19F beside her mother in the 86-passenger plane, a window seat that would typically offer spectacular views of the Andes Mountains and the Amazon basin below. The aircraft was nearly full, carrying families returning home for the holidays, researchers like themselves, and business travelers brave enough to venture into Peru's interior during the rainy season. As the Electra's engines spooled up and the aircraft began its taxi toward the runway, Juliane pressed her face against the small window, watching the familiar landscape of Lima fade below. The city's sprawling neighborhoods gave way to the stark beauty of the Peruvian highlands, and then to the endless green carpet of the Amazon rainforest. This was a view she had seen dozens of times, but it never failed to inspire a sense of wonder about the complexity of the ecosystem that had become her family's life's work. The flight was scheduled to take approximately 1 hour, a routine hop that would deliver them to the small airfield at Iquitos, where they would then take a smaller aircraft to the landing strip nearest to Panguana. Maria had brought along some of her latest research notes, intending to review them during the brief journey. The work never stopped for the Koepckes. Every moment was an opportunity to advance human understanding of the natural world. What none of the passengers could have known was that they were flying directly into one of the most intense weather systems Peru had experienced in years. The rainy season had brought with it a series of powerful thunderstorms that meteorologists were only beginning to understand. The primitive weather tracking systems of 1971 provided limited warning about the severity of the conditions ahead, and pilots often relied more on experience and instinct than on sophisticated instruments. As the aircraft climbed to its cruising altitude, the first signs of turbulence began to shake the cabin. The initial bumps were nothing unusual. Passengers on flights over the Andes and Amazon had learned to expect rough air as a matter of course. But as they penetrated deeper into the storm system, the turbulence became more violent, more unpredictable. The plane flew into a swirl of pitch-black clouds, with flashes of lightning glistening through the windows. The cabin lights flickered as electrical systems struggled to maintain power in the face of the storm's electromagnetic fury. Outside, the world had disappeared into a wall of impenetrable darkness, broken only by the stroboscopic flash of lightning that revealed, for brief moments, the towering thunderheads that surrounded them. The passengers began to shift uneasily in their seats, some reaching for the airsickness bags that had been thoughtfully provided in the seat pockets. Others clutched their armrests, their knuckles white with the effort of maintaining composure in the face of increasingly violent motion. The aircraft was being tossed about like a toy, rising and falling hundreds of feet in seconds, as it encountered the powerful updrafts and downdrafts within the storm cell. Maria reached over and took her daughter's hand, her own scientific composure masking the growing concern she felt about their situation. As an ornithologist, she understood weather patterns and the behavior of birds in storms, knowledge that told her they were encountering something far more severe than typical tropical turbulence. The intensity of the lightning, the violence of the wind shear, and the absolute darkness outside the windows all suggested they had flown into the heart of a supercell thunderstorm. The cabin crew, trained to project calm confidence even in the most challenging conditions, moved through the aircraft checking that seat belts were securely fastened and that loose items were properly stowed. Their professional demeanor provided some reassurance to the passengers, but the increasingly violent motion of the aircraft made it clear that this was no ordinary rough weather. In the cockpit, the flight crew was dealing with a situation that was rapidly moving beyond their control. The primitive navigation systems of the early 1970s provided limited guidance in severe weather, and the intensity of the storm was overwhelming their instruments. Radio contact with ground control was sporadic, interrupted by the electrical interference generated by the massive thunderstorm surrounding them. As the aircraft continued to fight its way through the storm, the passengers could only wait and hope that the experienced crew would find a way to navigate through the tempest. The sound of the engines, normally a reassuring constant, became irregular as the pilots struggled to maintain control in the face of wind shear that could drop or lift the aircraft hundreds of feet in seconds. Juliane, her face still pressed against the window, watched the lightning illuminate the churning clouds that surrounded them. Each flash revealed a landscape that seemed alien and hostile, a world of towering cumulonimbus clouds that dwarfed their small aircraft. The beauty of the storm was undeniable, but so was its awesome power, a force of nature that reduced human technology to insignificance. The teenager who had grown up among the wonders of the Amazon, who had learned to identify dozens of bird species by their calls, and to navigate jungle trails by reading the subtle signs of animal movement, was about to face a test that would challenge every survival skill her unique upbringing had provided. But in that moment, as the aircraft continued its desperate struggle against the storm, she was simply a 17-year-old girl holding her mother's hand, hoping that they would soon emerge from the darkness into clear skies. The storm, however, was far from finished with them. Part 2, the moment of destruction. The violence that followed exceeded anything the passengers of Lanza Flight 508 could have imagined. The aircraft, which had been fighting its way through the storm for what seemed like hours, but was actually only minutes, suddenly encountered a force that overwhelmed every system designed to keep it aloft. The Lockheed Electra, built to withstand the stresses of commercial aviation, met its match in the raw, primal power of the Amazonian thunderstorm. The end came with shocking suddenness. One moment, the aircraft was being tossed about like a leaf in a hurricane, its passengers gripping their seats and praying for the turbulence to pass. The next, there was a sound unlike anything Juliane had ever heard, a metallic shriek that seemed to come from the very soul of the aircraft as it was torn apart by forces beyond human comprehension. The plane flew into a swirl of pitch-black clouds, with flashes of lightning glistening through the windows. And in that moment of illumination, the impossible happened. The aircraft, which had carried them safely through the first hour of their journey, began to disintegrate around them. The sound was indescribable, a combination of tearing metal, screaming wind, and the desperate cries of passengers who suddenly found themselves facing the unthinkable. Juliane felt her mother's hand tighten around hers as the cabin filled with debris and the deafening roar of wind. The carefully ordered world of the passenger compartment became a chaos of flying objects, torn upholstery, and the terrifying realization that the barrier between the safety of the cabin and the hostile environment outside had been breached. The aircraft's structural integrity, compromised by the extreme stresses of the storm, reached its breaking point. In the midst of this catastrophe, something extraordinary happened. Experts have said that she survived the fall because she was harnessed into her seat, the window seat, which was attached to the two seats to her left as part of a row of 3. That was thought to have functioned as a parachute or helicopter, which slowed her fall. While the aircraft broke apart around her, Juliane remained secured in her seat, still strapped in by the safety belt that would prove to be her salvation. The sensation of falling was unlike anything she had ever experienced. At an altitude of about 10,000 feet, I'm alone, and I'm falling, slicing through the sky. The world became a blur of motion and sound, the green canopy of the Amazon rainforest rushing toward her at terminal velocity. The air screamed past her ears, and she felt the impossible sensation of weightlessness, combined with the terrifying knowledge that she was plummeting toward the earth. The row of seats that had remained intact became her unlikely aircraft, spinning and tumbling through the air as it fell. The physics of her survival were extraordinary. The seats, and the young woman strapped to them, fell at a rate that, while still potentially fatal, was slower than free fall. The configuration of the seats, with their weight and air resistance, created a crude but effective parachute system that reduced her terminal velocity just enough to make survival possible. As she fell through the storm-torn sky, Juliane's scientific training, inherited from her parents, allowed her to maintain a degree of awareness even in the face of unimaginable terror. The dense canopy of the Amazon rainforest, which had been the subject of her parents' life's work, rushed up to meet her. The same jungle that had provided her family with endless opportunities for discovery was about to become her salvation or her tomb. The impact, when it came, was brutal but not immediately fatal. She survived the fall with a broken collarbone, a deep gash to her right arm, an eye injury, and concussion. The rainforest canopy, with its multiple layers of vegetation, acted as a natural cushion system. The seats crashed through the upper canopy, breaking branches and tearing through vines, each impact slowing their descent incrementally. The energy of the fall was dissipated through multiple collisions with the jungle's natural architecture. When consciousness returned, Juliane found herself alone in a world that was both familiar and utterly alien. The sounds of the Amazon surrounded her, the calls of birds, the rustle of leaves, the distant sound of flowing water. But these familiar sounds were now overlaid with the reality of her situation. She was injured, alone, and hundreds of miles from any form of human assistance. The injury to her eye made it difficult to see clearly, and the concussion left her disoriented and nauseous. The broken collarbone sent waves of pain through her body with every movement, and the deep gash on her arm was bleeding steadily. These were serious injuries that would have sent anyone to a hospital under normal circumstances. But Juliane was no longer living under normal circumstances. As she struggled to assess her situation, the full magnitude of what had happened began to sink in. The aircraft that had carried 86 passengers and crew members had been destroyed in the storm. The other passengers, including her mother, were nowhere to be seen. The jungle had swallowed any trace of the aircraft's destruction, leaving only scattered debris, and the lone teenager who had somehow survived the impossible. The Amazon rainforest that surrounded her was the same ecosystem her parents had devoted their lives to studying. But experiencing it as a crash survivor was entirely different from observing it as a researcher. The jungle was simultaneously beautiful and dangerous, a complex web of life that could either sustain her or destroy her. Every sound could indicate either a source of food and water or a predator that might see her as prey. The first priority was shelter. The jungle was entering its rainy season, and the storms that had brought down the aircraft would continue for months. Without protection from the elements, even her miraculous survival of the fall would be meaningless. Using knowledge gained from countless trips to her parents' research station, she began to assess the resources available to her. Water was the most immediate concern. The human body could survive for weeks without food, but only days without water. The sound of flowing water that she had heard upon regaining consciousness became her beacon of hope. In the Amazon, streams and rivers represented not just life-sustaining water, but also the possibility of transportation and, eventually, contact with human civilization. The injury to her arm was bleeding heavily, and she knew that infection was a serious threat in the tropical environment. The jungle teemed with bacteria and parasites that could turn even a minor wound into a life-threatening condition. Her parents had taught her about the medicinal properties of various plants, but applying that knowledge while injured and disoriented would be challenging. As night fell on her first day in the jungle, Juliane faced the terrifying reality of her situation. She was alone in one of the world's most challenging environments, injured and without supplies, with no way to signal for help. The sounds of the jungle, which had seemed comforting during daylight, took on a more sinister quality in the darkness. The calls of nocturnal animals, the rustle of vegetation, and the distant sounds of predators reminded her that she was now part of the food chain. The teenager, who had grown up visiting her parents' research station, had learned to appreciate the beauty and complexity of the rainforest ecosystem. But she had always experienced it from the security of the research station, with proper equipment, medical supplies, and the knowledge that help was available if needed. Now she was experiencing the jungle as her ancestors had, as a place where survival depended entirely on knowledge, skill, and determination. The mental challenges were as daunting as the physical ones. The loss of her mother, though she had not yet found Maria's body, weighed heavily on her mind. The knowledge that she was the sole survivor of a catastrophic accident that had killed dozens of people created a psychological burden that threatened to overwhelm her physical injuries. The guilt of survival, the fear of being alone, and the daunting task of staying alive in the jungle all competed for her attention. But Juliane possessed something that most crash survivors did not: a deep, scientific understanding of the environment that surrounded her. Her parents had raised her not just to appreciate the beauty of the rainforest, but to understand its complex systems and relationships. This knowledge, gained through years of accompanying her parents on research expeditions, would prove to be her greatest asset in the days ahead. As she prepared to spend her first night alone in the jungle, Juliane could not have known that her ordeal was just beginning. The fall from the aircraft had been survived, but the real test of her survival skills lay ahead. The Amazon rainforest, with its beauty and brutality, would test every lesson her parents had taught her about the natural world. Part 3: The Forest's Daughter. Dawn broke over the Amazon rainforest on December 25, 1971, Christmas Day, revealing a world that seemed to mock the devastation of the previous day. The jungle had already begun to reclaim the crash site, vines creeping over scattered debris, insects investigating the foreign objects that had fallen from the sky. For Juliane, awakening to her second day as the sole survivor of Lanza Flight 508, the beauty of the rainforest was tempered by the harsh reality of her situation. The pain from her injuries had intensified overnight. The broken collarbone made every movement an exercise in careful planning, and the gash on her arm had become infected despite her attempts to clean it. The concussion left her dizzy and nauseous, making it difficult to think clearly about her predicament. But her parents' scientific training had instilled in her a methodical approach to problem solving that would prove invaluable in the days ahead. Water remained her primary concern. The sound of flowing water that had guided her on the first day led her to a small stream that would become her lifeline. Her father had taught her that in the Amazon, all streams eventually lead to larger rivers, and rivers were the highways of the jungle. Where there were rivers, there would eventually be people, indigenous communities, researchers, or commercial operations that might provide rescue. The decision to follow the stream was both practical and profound. She was able to trek through the dense Amazon jungle for 10 days and found shelter in a hut. But this simple statement belies the extraordinary challenges she faced during those days. The jungle was a maze of vegetation, fallen trees, and hidden dangers. Every step had to be carefully considered, every decision weighed against the possibility of becoming hopelessly lost. The rainforest that her parents had studied with such devotion revealed itself to be both nurturing and hostile. The canopy above provided protection from the sun, but also created a perpetual twilight that made navigation difficult. The vegetation was so dense that she could barely see more than a few feet ahead, and the constant humidity made every breath feel like drowning in slow motion. The sounds of the jungle bird calls, insect buzzing, the rustle of small animals created a symphony that was both beautiful and nerve-wracking. Food was a constant concern. The Amazon teemed with edible plants and fruits, but it also contained countless species that were toxic or dangerous. Her parents had taught her to identify some edible plants, but the risk of poisoning was real and potentially fatal. She found herself surviving on candy that had been in her purse during the flight. A bizarre juxtaposition of modern convenience and prehistoric survival. The psychological challenges were as daunting as the physical ones. The silence of the jungle, broken only by natural sounds, was profound after a lifetime of human civilization. The absence of her mother's voice, the lack of any human contact, and the constant awareness that she was entirely alone in one of the world's most challenging environments created a mental burden that threatened to overwhelm her physical injuries. But Juliane possessed something that sustained her through the darkest moments: the knowledge that her parents would never stop looking for her. Hans Wilhelm, waiting at the research station, would have expected their arrival on Christmas Day. When they failed to appear, he would have initiated a search that would eventually lead to her rescue. This knowledge provided the psychological strength she needed to continue moving forward, even when every step was agony. The infection in her arm worsened as the days passed. The tropical environment, with its high humidity and bacterial load, turned the wound into a breeding ground for infection. She could feel the heat of fever building in her body, and the smell of infected tissue became a constant reminder of her mortality. The knowledge that many crash survivors died not from their initial injuries, but from subsequent infections, made her situation increasingly desperate. Her parents' research station had been equipped with modern medical supplies, but those were still days away through terrain that would challenge even a healthy, well-equipped expedition. The irony was not lost on her. She was walking toward the very place where her parents had dedicated their lives to understanding the ecosystem that now threatened to claim hers. The days blurred together in a haze of pain, exhaustion, and determination. The stream she followed grew larger as other tributaries joined it, confirming her father's teaching that water always flows toward larger bodies. The vegetation gradually changed as she moved through different microenvironments within the rainforest, each with its own challenges and opportunities. Local lumberjacks found her and took her by canoe back to civilization. The moment of rescue, when it finally came, was both miraculous and anticlimactic. After 10 days of solitary struggle against the jungle, the sight of the small hut and the sound of human voices seemed like a hallucination. The lumberjacks who found her were initially skeptical of her story. The idea that a teenage girl could survive a plane crash and 10 days alone in the Amazon seemed impossible. But the evidence was undeniable. Her injuries, her condition, and the debris from the aircraft that searchers had begun to locate confirmed her incredible story. The rescue that followed was swift and efficient, with medical personnel rushing to treat her injuries and investigators eager to understand how she had survived when all others had perished. The flight to medical facilities in Lima was a journey through time as well as space. The sophisticated medical equipment of the hospital contrasted sharply with the primitive conditions she had endured in the jungle. The antibiotics that fought her infection, the surgery that repaired her wounds, and the diagnostic equipment that assessed her injuries represented the pinnacle of 1970's medical technology. A stark contrast to the Stone Age survival skills that had kept her alive. The media attention that followed her rescue was intense and, at times, overwhelming. The story of a teenage girl surviving a plane crash and 10 days alone in the Amazon captured the imagination of people around the world. But for Juliane, the attention was a mixed blessing. While it brought recognition to her survival story, it also meant reliving the trauma of the crash and the loss of her mother countless times. The investigation into the crash of Lanza Flight 508 revealed the complex factors that had led to the disaster. The severe weather conditions, the limitations of 1970's aviation technology, and the challenges of flying in the Amazon region all contributed to the tragedy. But these technical explanations provided little comfort to the families of the 85 people who had died in the crash. For Hans Wilhelm Koepcke, the rescue of his daughter was both a miracle and a tragedy. The joy of her survival was tempered by the devastating loss of his wife and research partner. On 24 December 1971, Koepcke's wife Maria was killed in the crash of Lanza Flight 508 in the Peruvian Amazon rainforest. The family's scientific partnership, which had produced groundbreaking research on Amazonian biodiversity, was forever changed by the events of that Christmas Eve. The long-term impact of her survival extended far beyond her personal story. Juliane's experience provided valuable insights into survival psychology, the importance of environmental education, and the resilience of the human spirit. Her story became a case study in survival training programs and inspired countless others facing their own challenges. The Amazon rainforest that had tested her so severely also became her salvation in a deeper sense. Her intimate knowledge of the ecosystem, gained through years of accompanying her parents on research expeditions, had provided the skills and knowledge necessary for survival. The jungle that had claimed her mother's life had also nurtured and protected her daughter, creating a complex relationship between the Koepcke family and the natural world they had dedicated their lives to studying. Years later, Juliane would return to the crash site, facing the demons of her past and finding a measure of peace with the events that had changed her life forever. The jungle had changed, as jungles do, but the lessons she had learned during those 10 days of survival remained with her. The experience had transformed her from a teenager, following in her parents' footsteps, into a woman with her own unique perspective on the relationship between humans and the natural world. Koepcke returned to the crash scene in 1998, a journey that represented both closure and continuity. The rainforest that had been the scene of such tragedy and triumph continued to thrive, indifferent to human suffering, but also capable of sustaining life in the most challenging circumstances. The crash site had been reclaimed by the jungle, but the lessons learned there continued to influence scientific understanding of survival and resilience. the story of Juliane Koepcke remains one of the most extraordinary survival stories in aviation history. Her 10 days alone in the Amazon rainforest, surviving injuries that would have killed most people, demonstrated the power of knowledge, determination, and the human will to survive. But perhaps more importantly, her story illustrated the complex relationship between humans and the natural world, a relationship that can be both destructive and sustaining, hostile and nurturing. The scientific legacy of her parents lived on through her survival, and her own subsequent contributions to our understanding of the natural world. The research station at Panguana, where her father had waited for a Christmas reunion that never came, continued to serve as a base for scientific research. The knowledge gained there, built upon the foundation laid by Maria and Hans Wilhelm Koepcke, contributed to our understanding of one of the world's most complex ecosystems. The broader implications of her story extend beyond the realm of survival tales. In an era of increasing environmental concern and the recognition of climate change's impact on global weather patterns, her experience serves as a reminder of the power of natural forces and the importance of understanding our relationship with the environment. The storm that brought down Lanza Flight 508 was a preview of the increasingly severe weather events that would characterize the late 20th and early 21st centuries. Today, as we face unprecedented challenges in our relationship with the natural world, the story of Juliane Koepcke offers both inspiration and instruction. Her survival was not merely a matter of luck or divine intervention, but the result of knowledge, preparation, and respect for the environment. The lessons learned in the Amazon rainforest during those 10 days in 1971 continue to resonate with anyone who faces seemingly impossible challenges. The mystery of how a 17-year-old girl could survive when all others perished remains a subject of scientific and philosophical speculation. The combination of factors, the configuration of the aircraft seats, the cushioning effect of the rainforest canopy, her injuries that were severe but not fatal, and her unique knowledge of the jungle environment created a scenario that defied the odds. But perhaps the most important factor was the intangible quality of determination, the refusal to surrender to circumstances that seemed hopeless. The Amazon rainforest, which had claimed so many lives over the centuries, had paradoxically preserved one. The ecosystem that her parents had devoted their lives to studying had tested their daughter and found her worthy of survival. In the end, the jungle that had taken Maria Koepcke's life had also saved her daughters, creating a legacy that continues to inspire and instruct more than 50 years after that fateful Christmas Eve flight.